Questions. You've seen the budget.
What are you calling this budget?
Look, I think it's a budget that's taking New Zealand backwards, ultimately, and it's a government where let's start that one again.
What are you calling this budget?
This is a budget that's taking New Zealand backwards. I'm not going to worry about a particular catchy phrase or whatever. It's a budget that is abandoning our commitments around climate change. It's putting more children into poverty. It's cutting a lot of the things that Kiwis rely on, like public transport subsidies and school lunch programs and so on. And the increase in funding for services like health and education isn't keeping up with the rising cost of living. So we'll see job losses in those sectors as a result of this year's budget.
Who are the biggest losers?
I think the biggest losers are the next generation of New Zealanders. So more children living in poverty, a cut in support for young New Zealanders, in a number of different ways, and for those young New Zealanders looking to towards the dream of home ownership, they're just being left behind.
You're questioning whether the government has borrowed to pay for those tax cuts and support, and that promise that it would. The finance minister says it's all covered by revenue and savings. What's your evidence?
The numbers are pretty clear. $10 billion worth of tax cuts, $12 billion worth of borrowing. You don't need to have an abacus to figure that out.
Isn't it a bit of a damning indictment on your government that they were able to find so many areas of significant savings when, just in the last 6 months?
Well, I think what we'll see over the coming months and in future years is the cost of those cuts. No cuts to government spending come without a longer-term price.
Like what? I mean, there's some of them. They found $5 billion worth of cuts. You're saying that all of that was necessary under your government?
Well, if you look at things like cutting support cutting the people working on stopping child exploitation and online scamming, ultimately New Zealanders will pay the price of that.
$300 million worth cuts.
So I'll come to you in a minute.
Who benefits from this budget?
Look, I think ultimately landlords and those who are doing well in the modern economy will benefit from this budget. Those who are working hard, barely scraping by, they're the ones that are being left behind.
What should everyday New Zealanders make of it?
I think everyday New Zealanders will find that life just continues to get tougher as a result of this budget. Any benefit that they get from tax cuts in the short term will be consumed by the fact that they're going to be paying higher rates, they're going to be paying higher insurance, they're going to be paying higher rents, they're going to be paying higher mortgage repayments, ultimately, and then you've got the extra costs of things like public transport and so on to add on top of that.
We Māori are the biggest losers in this budget, don't you think? Because we not only didn't get any Kuiti apart from Matatini, but we lost over $300 million. So you've got to say that Māori are the biggest losers.
I certainly think Māori are losing out of this budget. A lot of the initiatives that were targeted at improving outcomes for Māori have been cut by this government.
Yeah, but they didn't.
If you're a pensioner couple, you'll be lucky to get a packet of chewing gum each a week from the tax cut that's been promised by this government. They were promised significantly more than that prior to the election. So I think older New Zealanders have a right to feel a bit left behind by this government, as do younger New Zealanders.
They're operating. No, go for it, Felix.
Was there anything that surprised you about this budget?
There wasn't anything particularly surprising about the budget. I think, ultimately it's a budget that's going to take New Zealand backwards. I think we did need to have a relatively restrained budget. I mean, you would have seen a fairly restrained budget had we been in government, but we would not have been cutting into the services that Kiwis rely on a day-to-day basis in the way they are. We certainly wouldn't have prioritised tax cuts at this point in the economic cycle.
Margaret Hipkins, we've seen little to no funding for Pacific peoples in this budget. What's your response to that?
It's an absolutely backwards budget. I feel for our Pacific people because we know, just like Māori, they are overrepresented in most of the socioeconomic statistics. But even some of the aspirations for Pacific people to be businesses, the Pacific Innovation Hub has been removed as one of the savings by this government. So it's a really disappointing day for Pacific people.
We've also seen cuts to the Thai internship program, which benefits a lot of young Pacific people. What's your response to that?
This government does not care for the aspirations of Pacific people.
$2.4 billion operating allowance over the coming years. I mean, it's a lot lower than what Grant Robertson was able to achieve. You're eyeing up those numbers. If you are re-elected, would you be looking at doing something similar?
I'm not going to speak about hypotheticals today.
Being elected as a hypothetical?
No, the $2.4 billion for operating allowance.
Why are you calling that a hypothetical? It was in the budget. I mean, they've had a...
But your question was... And your question was, yeah.
How would it be tackled in structure?
I'm surprised the structural deficits are actually larger than what Grant Robertson had, except in 2020 when there was the wage subsidy. We would have had to look at some form of productivity fiscal policy. So what we're not seeing enough in the government is around building the productive side of the economy. We wouldn't have done tax cuts because it just wasn't worth it in the current economic environment.
Do you think that this budget reflects a lack of advocacy so that people have seen that there's no Pacific increase in budget and government?
Absolutely, it reflects that there is no Pacific voice around the cabinet table and that it's not a priority for them.
You've said that interest rates will rise. That's not what you're saying.
We said higher for longer.
Higher for longer.
Yeah. And based on the Reserve Bank's comments just last week, which basically said that if this budget, stimulates the economy and the fiscal impulse in the budget is positive for the next 2 years, that's likely to lead to higher interest rates for longer.
Sorry if this has already been asked, but I think in your PR you framed up the tax cuts as a broken promise. Why is it a broken promise? They seem largely in line with National's back pocket.
They promised the average New Zealand working family with 2 children $250 a fortnight. The majority get about $60 a fortnight.
I think New Zealanders should be gutted or disappointed.
I think New Zealanders were lied to during the last election campaign.
That inconsistency was raised during the election campaign, though, wasn't it? So we said if they broke the promise, that was at the time, not now.
And they continued to promise New Zealanders, even after that point, they continued to promise $250 a fortnight for the average working family with children.
To Ben's point, though, it was up to $250, so it's not necessarily...
If you go back and you find, you'll find multiple instances where the up to was never mentioned by them during the election campaign.
The low operating allowances in the future, they seem to suggest that every year the government will be coming back and cutting if they want to change budgets at all. Is that what you expect to see in each of the subsequent budgets to meet the operating allowance?
Look, we've been in this environment before where you starve public services of basic cost pressures, then, and you continue to nip away at them and continue to cut, then you do end up in a situation where you've got schools and hospitals really badly run down, where you've got public services that are just struggling to keep even the lights on, and that's what we're likely to see if the approach of this government continues.
Is there anything in there that you like?
Of course, in any budget there'll be the odd thing here and there. I think increased investment in infrastructure is something that we must do as a country. Although I do note, we haven't had a chance to really kind of bore into the numbers yet, that they seem to be claiming quite a lot of the infrastructure spending that was allocated under the previous government as if it's their own. But we'll get into that in due course.
In terms of your lockup, I mean, how does that work? Is that just you, or are there other opposition parties in with you?
Just the 3 opposition parties.
Were Tea Party Māori there?
Yes.
What can we do with the coalition dynamics based on some of the gains that the coalition partners have?
A bit too soon to tell you. We'll work our way through that in due course. Yeah. Look, I'm certainly not announcing a tax policy for 3 years from, or 2 years from now. We've still got 2 more budgets to go before then, but we'll have a tax policy that will indicate what we would do around tax rates across the board before the next election.
The problem is that they're hypocritical, not that they're responsible.
What was that?
Your problem, though, is that they're hypocritical, or that lie during the campaign supposed to.
Oh, no, and they're not responsible at this point in the economic cycle. Borrowing $12 billion to fund $10 billion worth of tax cuts isn't a responsible thing to do right now.
So if they're irresponsible, why not commit to getting rid of them?
Because the situation will be very different 2.5 years from now. There'll be 2 more budgets to go before then. So, trying to write a budget for, 3 more budget cycles into the future at this point would be just crazy. Of course, I mean, you can't write a tax policy for something that's going to happen 2.5 years from now when you don't know what might happen in the meantime.
What can New Zealanders take from what you're saying, though? Because on the one hand you're criticising, on the other hand you won't put a stake in the ground as to where Labour sits on this.
Well, because the next election's 2.5 years away.
And New Zealand's income taxes for lower or medium income workers, that's quite a Labour-friendly policy, isn't it, in principle?
I mean, they're trying to dress it up that way, but if you look at a minimum wage worker, for example, getting an extra 30 cents an hour, that's less than they would have got if they'd increased the minimum wage by the rate of inflation.
Well, in your tax policy consideration, would you consider looking at indexation, even if you change the brackets and higher, whatever you do? Would you consider indexation?
We're not going to write our tax policy right now.
Would you consider it, though? Is that something you'd have to...
Well, look, I've always said that I'm sympathetic to the idea that tax brackets should be adjusted periodically from time to time. How frequently that happens is something that, we will have a position on in the future.
What is the argument in favour of allowing fiscal drag? It seems like it's something just...
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Nicola Willis talks about the 16 years that it's been since tax brackets were last adjusted. Labor was only in government for 6 of those.
Yeah.
For New Zealand's tourism, how does it feel being on the other side of the proverbial coin at this time?
Opposition's nowhere near as much fun as being in government. I mean, that stands to reason. We'll be working very hard to get back onto the other side of the aisle in the next election. No, I don't think it's deflated. It's just that people are reading the budget. For most MPs, 2 o'clock is when they first get to see the budget. You know, a few of us get an hour's head start, but for most of them, they would have had their heads down because they're actually trying to figure out what's in the budget. I think we should be focused on rebuilding our tourism sector right at the moment. You know, in the post-COVID period, international tourism still hasn't quite, returned to the levels that New Zealand needs it to be at for our tourism sector to really fully bounce back. So I think the government should be focused on rebuilding our tourism industry, and they're actually cutting funding for support for things like marketing of tourism at a time when they're increasing the visitor levy. That's a bit of a blow for the tourism industry. Look, I think the thing about this is, there's people who can't talk back. They can't explain the work they do. They can't explain the value of the work that they do. So they're easily maligned. But if you go back, say, 4 years, and a government of the day 4 or 5 years ago or 5 years actually, let's do the maths in my head. You go back 5 years and the government of the day said, actually, we've decided that the Ministry of Health needs a bit of trimming back. We've got these people preparing for an event that may never happen, so we're just going to trim that out because we don't think that that's prudent right now. A year later, a global pandemic arrived. We were grateful that we'd had those people working on that. Across the government, the public sector, you'll find people doing that kind of work. It's work that's, preparing for events that may never happen, like natural disasters. It's people who are doing really valuable work to protect New Zealanders in ways that they don't even know that that's happening. So the people working to prevent child exploitation, the people who are working to prevent online scamming, these are valuable services for New Zealanders, and New Zealand will be worse off from not having them. It always takes a few weeks to work through just the numbers in the budget, but then it can often be some time before you realise the real consequences of that. So if you take early childhood education, for example, they've been given a 2% funding increase in this budget. I can tell you as a former Minister of Education, that won't keep the lights on for some early childhood services. There will be ECE services who are laying teachers off or even closing up because 2% just isn't keeping up with their increasing costs. And that'll take a wee while to work its way through the system.
Can I ask your analysis of the coalition dynamics based on the gains the coalition partners got?
So first of all, they clearly must have been in a lot of disagreement because it looks like they didn't sign off the budget until around April. Obviously, with the budget policy statement that was released quite late, the latest it could be, it was quite clear again that they hadn't had an agreement to it. If I actually look at some of the infrastructure, so just my first look at the infrastructure spending, so we see that Shane Jones gets about 1.22 million, but actually if you billion. But if you actually step back and you look at where the 200 million is going here, I calculated it roughly around, actually there's about 700 million that he's getting, so less than the $1 billion that was promised in the coalition agreement. So they've kind of dressed some things up. Well, the fact that the cancer drugs are not going to be funded this year, I think that is incredibly disappointing for those who were promised that they were going to get them. It is life and death for a lot of people, so I think it's just disappointing, and it just shows that they didn't get what they wanted either.
Government spending as a percentage of GDP is higher now than it was prior to the pandemic. Nobody, including National, seems keen to get it back to what it was in 2017. What is it about New Zealand, the economy, that means government spending has to be higher as a percentage of the economy now?
Well, actually, it could be lower, but it comes down to choices. So the government chose to do tax cuts. Nicola Willis put her job on the line in relation to that and has cut back a huge amount of public spending to pay for that. If you look at the actual borrowing tracks, so obviously $10 billion in tax cuts, $12 billion in borrowing, so the government bonds that are going to be released obviously later today. And then if you look over a similar forecast period of 4 years, National is borrowing $14.4 billion more than Labor would have. So for me, it's quite fiscally irresponsible at this time.
Just on that issue around government spending as a percentage of GDP, if we want to have a country that goes backwards on a year-by-year basis, then an arbitrary figure to trim back the government spending as a proportion of GDP is the fast way to get us there. The reality is our population is getting older. That's going to increase the cost of superannuation. It's going to increase the cost of healthcare. We've got massive infrastructure deficits across the country that need to be remedied. That's going to increase capital spending, but it's also going to increase the operating spending that goes with those assets. So the truth is, if we actually want to tackle the long-term challenges New Zealand faces, that's incompatible with a goal of reducing government spending as a proportion of GDP.
With all your criticism of the budget so far, do you think it will resonate with the average New Zealander? End of the day, budget 2024, we've got tax relief for lots of people and spending increasing in health and
spending in areas like health and education is actually going backwards in real terms, and I think that New Zealanders will feel that. They will see the difference in the deterioration of those public services. In early childhood education, parents will end up paying more for early childhood education because a 2% funding increase just doesn't cut it. So ECE fees will go up and some centres will end up closing and parents will have to move their kids somewhere else. So I think they will notice that.
Okay, so you don't back the increased spending in health out of this budget compared to last?
Well, we'll work through exactly how that breaks down because, of course, they've done a 3-year figure. But ultimately, our preliminary analysis suggests that the advice that was released previously from Te Whatu Ora about what they needed just to keep up with rising costs, that their cost pressures haven't been met by this budget. Cool. Thanks, everybody.